Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Salam alaikum. Thank you for joining to our another webinar, and it's very exciting. We have John Sanders from Edge Hill University. John holds multiple qualifications, including MB, honors, MSc, MD, MRCP, UK, MRCGP, FA, CAD, MED, a diploma in counseling, diploma in palliative medicine, certified education, and FHEA. I hope I pronounce all of them correctly. He has built a distinguished academic career in medical education, serving as an associate professor at the Leeds Institute of Medical Education, University of Leeds, and previously as a professor of medical education at the University of Sheffield. In 2026, he joined Edge Hill University as professor of medical education. John currently leads the Health and Social Care Workforce and Development Research Group and is a co-lead of the NW Palliative Care Network's Palliative Care Education Research Group. John is also an advisor for Al Sadiq University. So he is very close to our heart, and he has always been very, very helpful and very gives very good advice and keeps us on the right path. And he is also the editor for our books, the one that is finishing medical education, modern medical education, and in the next one, the medical education and AI. So I welcome John. Thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Sakina, and welcome everyone. So I hope that hopefully you will find today's talk interesting. What I'm going to talk about is case study research. So first of all, I'll explain what it is, then how to do it, and then some of the challenges, because there are some challenges. And hopefully at the end of it, you will have an increased understanding, and then we can have a discussion as well. So, what is case study research? There are lots of definitions, but for me, this is probably one of the simplest definitions, and it basically summarizes what I consider to be case study research as well. So, if we look at it in great detail, there are certain aspects. First of all, it's a methodological research approach. It's not a method, it's a methodology. And within that are methods which can either be quantitative or qualitative or both. The key aspect of it as a methodology is that it's designed to generate an in-depth understanding of a particular problem, and it's within a bounded system. And that this is fundamental. So if we look at, and we're not going to go into it now, the ontology of how we actually view the world. This is how we view the world within a bounded system. And hopefully this will all come clearer as we begin to explain it. So probably one of the first case studies that has been described as case study research was by Herodotus, who was a Greek who was interested in the triggers of suicide in Greek soldiers. And what he did was to consider each soldier as a unique case. And for each case, he obtained a deep understanding of what were the triggers for suicide in each of these particular soldiers. So here it is here. This is some of the work which is attributed to him. And from that, he felt that there was a common theme of guilt and dishonor. And that triggered their suicide. And in the top left-hand corner, essentially what it's doing is to bring together all these case studies to try and get a common theme. So, how do we conduct case study? The first thing is to develop what's called a unit of analysis. This is the bounded area. And here is a paper from my doctorate. And it was looking at online collaborative learning for healthcare continuing professional development. These were at that time for public health doctors. And I did a cross-case analysis of 3 case studies. And the unit of analysis was a single online collaborative learning network. So we had 3 of them. There were 2 around Manchester and 1 in another part of the UK. And we set them up, and each of them I started to look at in great detail what worked, what didn't work. And I also provided a rich description of each network. Each network was different. They had different groups of participants. They were in different parts of the country. Although there were 2 in Manchester, they were in different areas of Manchester. And they were set up differently as well. And I also got this rich description by combining both quantitative and qualitative research, which is mixed method research. So I did telephone interviews. These were busy doctors. It was difficult to get them together to do face-to-face. I analysed discussions that they did. I looked at the various posts and what they contained and coded them. And also, because we had set up these networks, we had a help desk, and we were able to keep a log and analyse the reasons why they were actually contacting us for further support. So mixed methods research combines both quantitative and qualitative approaches. And the reason for doing this is to give a richer understanding than using just one single method. And there are these major approaches. And the 2 main approaches are what's called convergent parallel. In other words, you collect quantitative data and qualitative data at the same time. And at the end of it, you look to see what you've got. So you're collecting 2 lots of data completely separately, and that's called convergent parallel. It's parallel because you collect the data separately at the same time, and it's convergent because you try and bring together what is the key messages from both the quantitative and the qualitative data. Common method is the explanatory sequential. In other words, you collect some data, which is quantitative, such as a questionnaire, or logs, such as the help logs. But we knew why people were contacting us, but we wanted to get further information why they were experiencing difficulties. And that was done by having interviews. And that's called explanatory sequential. So it's an explanatory mixed method study. You can do a qualitative study to begin with, and then you might find some particular themes and you wonder whether, in fact, a larger population also has something similar, and that's called exploratory sequential. But the majority of case study research is either convergent parallel or explanatory sequential. And what I did was to do a cross-case analysis where I looked for similarities and differences across each case. And what I actually found is that there were lots of similarities across, despite each case being slightly different. there were some common similarities. And I came up with certain recommendations, such as if we're going to implement them in the future, they need to be based actually on the requirements of potential users. We just set them up, and some people didn't engage because it wasn't what they wanted. We also needed to make sure that they liked to use the approach. At that time, the majority of people were not using online networks, and they disliked using that. They preferred to have used email or telephone to contact each other. But also, the organisation needed to give people time to actually engage in this activity, to share and to learn from each other. And people found that difficult to do. So I was able to identify these important recommendations. Now, if we look at the different types of case study, they can be purely descriptive. That's what Herodotus did. So you're just describing what you found. This is a bit like the case studies that we have as clinicians, where we just describe a case of somebody with tonsillitis who had a purple nose. It's something which is unusual, something which is interesting. However, for case study research, it tends to be more exploratory and interpretive, making sense out of what happened in that particular case. But you can also have experimental, where you actually, if you wanted to do it, you could do a randomized control trial within that particular case study. That's rarely done. But the most important aspect of case study research is to get this rich understanding using usually mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative. And as I said, it's important for case study research, and this is where many novices struggle, is to identify what is actually the unit of analysis. And if you read any of the major books, and I'll give you recommend some at the end, it's finding the unit and deciding on the unit of analysis is important. Is it a person you're interested in? Such as doctors in their first year of practice? Is it events? Doctors who experience a particular event in their life, or where there is absenteeism from work? Or is it the organisation? And all these aspects are really, really important to think about. Because what we have of the unit of analysis is like where that star is. This is a person, an event, or an organisation. And whatever it is bounded in time and space. All research is bounded in time and space. You conduct research at a moment in time in a particular setting. We always have to remember that. And it's really, really important in case study research to be giving that type of information, because many aspects of what we are observing occur within a specific geographical context, in which case we have particular cultural and social patterns. And it's important, which we'll talk about later, generalization from case studies, to actually understand that particular context in greater detail. What happens in England is different to where it is in, say, Saudi Arabia or in Pakistan. We need to understand that. How is the person trained? How are these events identified? How is the organisation structured? These will all vary from place to place. When we're collecting data at a moment in time and within a specific context. And that's where we call it bounded in time and space. And that's all we have. And that's what we need, what we can celebrate. We can also have what's called embedded case studies. And this is some work we did a couple of years ago, looking at what was called multidisciplinary training hubs in Northwest England. So our case study was training hubs in Northwest England. What training hubs were, as it said, multidisciplinary centres for training. So people would come into them from Northwest England. There would be training within that hub, and then people would go back. Northwest England is an area of England. So that was a case study of looking at Northwest England, because within Northwest England was different to Northeast England, to Southwest England, to Southeast England, to Central England. These training hubs were all set up differently. So the case study was Northwest England, and we looked at training hub leads because there were several of these sort of subgroups within Northwest England, and they were particular case studies as well. So we had what is called embedded case studies. And we did these interviews with the training hub leads, and we identified some, through cross-case synthesis, 4 major themes. So what's the big challenge of case study research? Well, by definition, case study is a rich description of a particular phenomena, something which is happening within a particular bounded context, either one individual, an event, such as a meeting of all doctors together. So say it was this online meeting, webinar. That could be seen as a case study, and we are looking at individuals within within this webinar. So what we're interested in is how people in the webinar are interacting. We're not interested in individuals, we're interested in the webinar. If we're interested in how an individual was interacting, that is a person. We might be looking at how this all fits into a much wider organisation, such as the dynamics of postgraduate medical education, and that would be the organisation. So the research is a rich and in-depth understanding of this particular phenomena, bounded by either the person, event, or the organisation. And this is called an intrinsic case study. Now, the big problem with that is all the data you have. You have that rich data of understanding. Can you actually generalize it to other areas? And what people are interested in is the transferability and applicability of this type of research. Transferability is the extent to which the outcomes of one study can be applied to another similar context. And applicability is the extent to which the processes of one study can be applied to another similar context. In other words, the processes are the intervention, what actually happens. Can you actually replicate those processes in another context? That's what we're interested in. That's what generalizability can be considered to be. And what we have is a rich description of context, processes, and research methods. That's what we have. What do we do with that? Well, we can increase the generalizability by having more participants. And by having more participants, ideally what we have purposive sampling. So if we've got more than one case, try and get participants with rich insights. So you might get some people, for example, who have a particular positive view about an experience, say a training course, and another group who don't have that. And you could identify that by questionnaire. And then you do in-depth interviews, not with everybody, but with individuals at the two extremes, so that you've got people with rich insights at the both extremes. You can also use what's called triangulation, where you're using multiple data sources, quantitative and qualitative, but also methods. So, for example, you might do a focus group and one or two interviews with individuals who've got with particular views, which is similar to purposive sampling. So you combine both together. You might also get more researchers. So it's not just yourself collecting the data and analysing it, but getting another researcher. Because one of the aspects about qualitative research is that it is a dynamic social interaction between two people, the researcher and the participant, or participants in a focus group. And that depends not just on the individual, but it also depends on the researcher. And the other thing you can do to increase generalizability is to synthesize the findings from one case with another case with another case to identify broader patterns and themes. And what we need to do also is to move from an intrinsic case study, which we've just described, so you've got a rich understanding of one particular case, to what's called an instrumental case study, where you can apply it into other contexts. The classical way is by using what's called analytic generalization, where you use frameworks and theories, because these provide a focus for the questions and also how you begin to code it. So rather than being inductive, you are deductive with a particular focus. So I'll give you some examples. So an example of one framework, if you're looking at implementation, say you're looking at the implementation of some evidence-based guidelines, you can use frameworks like the theoretical domains framework or the consolidated framework for implementation research, because these have particular domains which can be explored. So, for example, the theoretical domains framework explains how and why people change their behavior. And there are 14 domains and 84 constructs. And there are guides on how you can structure your questions so that it fits into those. Then you can compare one group with another group because you've got a rich understanding across certain domains. The consolidated framework for implementation research looks at individual, organizational, and system factors for change in organizations. That has 5 domains and 39 constructs. So by using both of these, you get a really, really rich understanding. And at the moment, I'm currently working with a PhD student on using the CFIR to look at educational aspects, because most of the work has been done on clinical. You can also use particular theory. So, for example, we did some work with some Chinese colleagues looking at self-directed learning with point-of-care information systems. And we adopted a theoretical framework called the capability approach. Because as you can see to begin with, it starts with a clinical encounter. Individuals have valued learning needs. Then you look at the extent to which those learning needs can be met by the available resources, and then the impact on clinical outcomes. And we use this model to give some structure so that when we were conducting the research, we were able to ask specific questions related to what type of clinical encounter, what were they learning, what would they value to learn from the point of care information system, what information did they actually achieve, and how did they put that information into clinical practice? Because that's the subtle difference. They might have got new learning and information, but can they put it into practice? And we looked at what's called conversion factors, the factors that enable and constrain. Now, by having this structure, it's much easier to compare it with other point of care information systems and for other areas, because you have this rich understanding which is much, much more structured. We also have this idea of general principles. So I was involved with doing some work with colleagues in Brazil, and they have a unique system called primary care workplace learning groups. So these groups meet regularly, and they have a facilitator, and they meet face to face on a regular basis. But it was heavily disrupted because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but they still continued to work. And that's what they were interested in beginning to understand. So this was essentially a case study in one area of Sao Paulo, which was a primary care workplace learning groups. That's what we were interested in. Within that, we had some embedded case studies with a couple of different learning groups. So basically, primary care workplace learning group as a collection was a case study in Brazil, in Sao Paulo in Brazil. In this article, we described in great detail what it was and the particular groups. And then we had several groups within that we brought together. What we're able to do is to identify some generalizable lessons. So lesson one was the importance of an agile organization in rapidly changing and complex environments. These organizations could rapidly change because they were autonomous and they weren't directly controlled by a health organization. It was these were people that regularly met because they wanted to meet and considered it to be important. Another lesson was that because it was a rapidly changing and complex environment, and if you look back to COVID-19, particularly in Brazil, because of various political views, there were concerns about, what they should be doing. Should they be giving medicines? Should they be doing this? Should they be doing that? And what worked particularly well in these learning groups was to allocate one person as an information broker to collect this information, sift through it, and present it to the group in an organized way. And another lesson was an appreciation of what's called the socio-technical system for technology adoption and implementation. Because what people preferred was using their normal technologies. In other words, they were using WhatsApp groups, using text messages. They were using these instead of using Teams or Zooms. So these were interesting aspects which could be used in other areas and are generalizable. So that's my talk about case study research. I hope it was interesting. If you want to read more about it, one of the classic books is by Robert Yin, Case Study Research and Applications, published by Sage. I wrote a chapter in a book, How to Do Primary Care Educational Research, on case study research. And for me, case study research is an important methodological approach. But in my experience, people often don't write that they are doing case study research. They are actually doing it, but they don't make it explicit. And I think one of the difficulties of not making it explicit that this approach is being taken is that you don't often get the richness of information. You don't know enough about the organization. You don't know enough about what is going on in that organization or the geographical aspect. I know we get some constraints because of the word limits in articles, but having that understanding is so, so important. Understanding how people were selected and why they were selected, getting this really rich description, combining quantitative and qualitative to get this rich and deep understanding, for me is essential for good quality case study research. And if we actually acknowledge that we were doing case study research, for me, I believe that we could enhance the quality of the research and the way that we present it to a wider audience. So I hopefully that was useful, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It was really amazing. So many details on different types of research. Anyone else have any questions? Please jump in. Don't miss the opportunity to ask John questions.
So, John, let me begin the discussion. I hope others will join in. So, there could be some ethical implications of the research, like you did, for example, on or somebody did on suicidal tendencies in a particular group. How do you anonymize these people if they're working in an institution? Because anonymizing in a serious thing like attempt to commit suicide, etc., would be important. It may raise a
Yeah,
few ethical questions.
yeah. And that's a really, really important issue. One way, and we're faced with this at the moment about this, I think number one is that you do not name the organization. You say that this is a hospital, okay, and just leave it at it's a case study of a district general hospital or whatever you want to call it, or a primary a secondary care hospital or a tertiary referral hospital in the UK. You give it like that, and then you describe it in some detail of how it's functioning, but you're careful so that you can't identify that area. That's the easiest way of doing it. And we're doing some contract research at the moment, and we want to look at which particular areas of the UK have been more successful and what lessons can be learned. But we are not going to state where these areas are. All we're saying is that we looked at these 4 areas, well, it's 6 areas, where this particular scheme was successful, educational scheme was successful. So you can't identify the areas. The individuals within that are obviously anonymous, but we're also saying that these are the people that we interviewed or will be interviewing in these areas, but we don't actually name them. We just say at the very beginning that the type of person that we're going to be interviewed that were interviewed are the following, and we give a selection of the types of people, and then when we use any quotations, all it will state is whether it is in area A, B, C, or D. We just leave it at that. So people find it really, really difficult to identify anybody. I think that's the ethical way of doing it.
As a corollary to the same question, if you're doing a longitudinal study, X number of participants, etc., subjects, and if there's an attrition, maybe 5% or whatever, how do you manage that?
I think you have to accept it. Put it crudely, it's a pain, but that's research. It's just like recruitment.
Do you go back to the number, or you continue with the number, exclude the X number in your case study?
Right. If you're going to be doing longitudinal research, I think in a case study, what you would do is to be explicit about what type of cases began to disappear. It tends to be less of a problem that case studies don't tend to. I mean, most longitudinal research is quantitative and it's numerical. There is increasing interest in doing qualitative longitudinal research. It tends not to be based on, it just means that you're doing interviews with one person over a longer period of time. So you're at an individual level. In a case study, usually it's not longitudinal, it's usually just bounded by a particular moment in time. But it's always a problem. My personal view is that it's the data. This is the data with, say 20 individuals. This is the data with 6 individuals. You're upfront about it, and you just say, and look at the you're in the dilemma with longitudinal qualitative research of whether you follow an individual and you look at a change within an individual over time, or whether you look at a synthesis at a moment and a synthesis after a period of time. There's a similar dilemma if you're doing quantitative research. So are you doing between across the group, or between individuals? So are you looking at a single change of a single person over time, or an amalgamation of people over time? And the same dilemma is still there if you do qualitative research, because you can analyze the themes for, say, 20 people at point A and 10 people at point B, and you will get a particular view because you've synthesized it. But equally so, you can look at changes across individuals over time as well. So if you've only got 10 people, you could look at the change also between people and individual from time A to time B and see if there are changes in the themes. And again, that's methodologically difficult in qualitative research compared with quantitative, but people do grapple with that.
Thanks, Alf.
Is that useful, and does it make sense what I've just said?
So over to Sakina.
Yeah.
I think Ahmed has a question.
Yes.
Ahmed.
Hello.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for this very interesting speech. It is a subject that we need to dive in more, I think. I want to ask something that is related to the nature of the case study research. So can you outline the fundamental differences between the case study research and, let's say, the qualitative? It's as you said, it can be a qualitative and quantitative, can make use of both. So can you elaborate more about this?
Right. It comes down to essentially what is known as ontology, how you view the world. Can you measure the world, or can you only observe the world? Now, I know this is a pretty broad generalization and very philosophical, and that there's an area of overlap. But essentially, it's your world view on how do you view the world. So quantitative researchers believe that they can measure something in an objective way. And that links to the epistemology, which is the nature of knowledge. So you can qualitative researchers believe that you can't measure things. All you've got, there's no objective measure. It's what people tell you. And that will vary from day to day and in the interactions. Because the whole of qualitative research is based usually on an interview or a focus group. And by definition, that is one or two people on a certain day in a certain place with a certain interviewer. And if you interview them again 2 days later, you may find that their views have changed. So if you ask people whether they like coffee, they may say that they do. They then go to a cafe, have a cup of coffee, and it's horrible, and then they don't like it. Now, quantitative researchers don't tend to discuss that as being a limitation of their research. But the reality is you still have similar aspects. So if you're doing a clinical trial, for example, you assume that things don't change, that all your patients are the same. But it's down to a fundamental view of the world and how certain you are about what is happening in the world. So I hope that answers it in a way. It's qualitative research tries to get a really rich, deep description of a phenomena. Quantitative research is difficult to do that because just by counting. So, for example, if you want to know how many people like pizza, that's easy to do with a questionnaire. But if you want to understand why some people like pizza and some people don't, you have to have an alternative way of understanding it. Now, you could give them a questionnaire, but if you give them options, where have you got those options from? That's your view of the world, which may be different by somebody else. But by doing qualitative research, you get a much deeper and richer understanding of why those individuals like pizza and don't like pizza. And you may actually be very surprised why they like it or don't like it. And the validity or the trustworthiness that can you believe it in qualitative research is where, when you're talking to lots of people, you are getting common themes coming through. So you become much more certain that what the individual is telling you, although it's what one individual is telling you, when you've spoken to several individuals, you can have a much firmer understanding. Does that kind of make sense? Does that answer your
yes.
question?
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
It's your worldview of, what you are actually observing, and it's the nature of the world.
Thanks.
Thanks. There's another
Suchita
colleague.
has a question. Suchita?
Yeah.
how would culture affect the general liability of a particular study?
100%. Sajita, thank you. 100%. And that is why it's so important to give that rich understanding. And particularly, my interest, like yours, is in medical education. So it assumes not just where the education is, it's going to be different in India, different in Pakistan, different in Saudi Arabia, as it to the UK or America. And one of the aspects is that, as you're probably aware, research publications tend to be dominated by Canada and America, particularly America, for all sorts of reasons, which we won't go into.
So now we have the global north and the global south.
Yes. And you really need to, it really needs to be explicit where the research has been conducted. And also the type, even more than that, because each medical school will have a slightly different slant. And some medical schools, for example, may have a particular religious affiliation, and that will alter it. But also, what we have to remember is that, like in England, we have an increasing number of international medical graduates. So if we're talking about junior resident doctors, say in dermatology, and we've done some interviews, we need to know, and if you regard each one as a particular case, what you need to understand is the makeup and background and characteristics of each of those doctors, not just their experience, but where they have trained, their cultural backgrounds. All of that is so important, because that ultimately, and at the end of the day, with all research, you have to look at it and think, to what extent do the findings from that study apply to my context? And only you, as the reader, can really do that. And for me, the only way I can do that is to have a lot rich, deep information about what is happening of the participants and the context in which the study and the intervention has taken place. I need to understand that. Is it somewhere which has got major results? Has it been funded by a pharmaceutical company? All that is so important.
True. And we also need to then address, I think, potential researcher bias in this case, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Well, absolutely. And some of the work, particularly related to quite personal things like gender, about values, the researcher needs to be very open about their own particular views and beliefs, because that is likely to influence, first of all, the topic of research. For example, dyslexic researchers are more likely to research dyslexic students because that's what they're interested in. A lot of work from, we did some work a few years ago looking at inclusivity and the research in medical education. Needless to say, people interested in gender, female particularly, were female researchers. So do they have a particular view? I'm not saying they do or they don't, but they need to be upfront about it. The topic, first of all, was chosen by them. They will set the questions, they will analyze the data, and what is most important, the way they present the data. Because what we forget in qualitative research, it's not just data collection and data analysis, it is data presentation. You've got this in quantitative research as well. So how do you make those conclusions? How do you present your findings And so reflexivity and a description of the researcher in all of those processes is so important. Absolutely, Suchita. And that's why we often don't do it when we're presenting research. Whereas I think case study research as a discipline gives you this opportunity to engage with a methodology where you are expected to do it because that is the standard of doing case study research. Whereas often what happens, particularly in health professions education research, it's not very explicit usually. Your research, you're explicit about your research method, but often not about the methodology.
Thank you, John, for that.
Yes.
John, you use two words, very interesting, epistemology and ontology. How many doctors normally know these terms?
Are you asking your colleagues, or are you asking my personal view?
No, I'm asking you because these are
very rarely, but that's because we're not taught about this, the more philosophical aspects usually in medical school yet. I mean, fundamentally, all research is three aspects. It's your axiology, your values, how that drives your research, and the next one is ontology, your view of what you can measure in the universe, and your epistemology, which is essentially how you consider knowledge. Can you count it? Is it socially constructed? But the ontology is how you view the world. So you've got people who view the world as something you can measure. You've got another group who consider that you can't measure it. You can only observe it. And there's another group, the realists, who believe that you can't really observe it. You can't really asking people. What you're looking at is this complex mix of what happens in certain circumstances. So what happens in a particular context? That's what they're interested in, because it will depend on the different contexts.
Slight divergence of the subject, but I think that is where I've been pleading for a long time that philosophy should be, or at least humanities should be, part of the pre-medical school education, because two persons, Edmund Pellegrino and John Eyre, they're the two persons. When you read the literature, medical literature, I've got plenty of times I keep reading all these useless things normally people will not read. John Eyre is what he talks about, this realistic approach, that you ignore everything, observe things, and come to a conclusion within your own system, your own values, etc., which is debatable. It cannot be defended generally. Pellegrino is my favorite in modern medical education because he says that instead of teaching zoology and botany and all this rubbish, you should be teaching humanities and philosophy and literature and poetry and art. Do you agree with that?
I think you need to be taught both, personally. And I don't think it's just medicine, personally. I think if you're in business, if you do graphic design, if you do computing, you need to think of the moral and ethical aspects, the philosophical aspects, as well as the technical aspects. You can be a computer scientist and creating, all the latest AI tools, but there are huge moral dilemmas. But the same as if you're doing business, the same as if you're doing graphic design, you need to be aware of the moral and ethical dimension of what you're doing. And I don't think you can actually separate it. And I think one of the problems with medical education is it's often separated as being quite distinct. whereas it's not. It's an overlapping Venn diagram. I don't think you can separate it. And I think an understanding and appreciation of both is so, so important. And that makes it an art and a science. So the art is an integral part of the science, and the science is an integral part of the art of being any professional. Personally, I think a professional is somebody who is regarded as being able to invert the term profess means that you have a certain amount of knowledge. That's what profess means. I profess in English language is that you have a certain amount of knowledge. So a profession is an individual who has a certain amount of bounded knowledge. So equally so, I think you can argue people doing other jobs such as an electrician or a builder, you still have an ethical and moral duty as well as doing the rest of it. And for me, I think having that moral and ethical aspect needs to begin in school and in university and through postgraduate training. It's an integral part of it. And I don't think we can separate it. That's my personal view.
We have a couple of questions on chat.
Yeah.
One is from Tara. It says, for a single case study in a low resource educational setting, how can we best use naturalistic generationalization to help readers judge whether our findings apply to their own context?
The only way you can do it, it's a really good question, is to provide that rich description. You need to describe as much as you can what your low resource educational setting is. And this is where having a particular framework, such as the CFIR, Consolidated Framework for Implementation Review, is so useful, because it looks at factors which are in the organization, within individuals. It looks at resources, structural aspects. It looks at a whole range of factors. And if you report like that, you'll have a more structured way of reporting your educational setting. You can see the extent to which that is similar or different to your setting.
Does that answer your question, Tara? Yes, okay. Another one is from Warda. It says, as a beginner who would want to work on a case study, what areas must he or she work on or learn before becoming part of case study project?
Okay, that's a good question as well. My advice is to read something about it. And the biggest thing is to develop your unit. What are you actually interested in? When anybody engages in research, the first thing we always say is you need to have a really, really, really tight question. Are you interested about an individual, understanding how an individual or individuals think and react to something, such as what are their views about ethics teaching? All those aspects means that your unit needs to be an individual, but it might be that you're looking at that only in one setting, such as one particular medical school. Now, if you're doing that, the unit of analysis could be the medical school in such and such a medical school, which is in a low resource setting. That's your case study, and you're looking at how individuals within such and such university, which is in a low resource setting, how individuals have these views. So what you've got, your case study is that low resource setting, and within that are individuals that you are interested in. So it's an embedded case study. Just like the Northwest England, we were interested only in Northwest England. So we described that in greater detail. So number one, you need to decide what you're really interested in. It might be that you're interested in a particular event. So it might be why individual doctors leave the profession. That's the event that you leave, that you're interested in. So that is what you're interested in overall. Recent people leaving at such and such a university or in a particular country. That becomes the case. And then within that, you've got embedded cases, which are individuals. But what you're interested in is how people are leaving within that particular context. So number one is the unit of analysis. The next one is a really rich description of the context so that you can begin to apply it naturalistic generalization to your situation. So you need to be able to collect rich data. And secondly, how do you collect that rich data? It usually means that you need to develop and to use mixed methods approaches. So what would I say you need to develop? Number one is have an understanding of defining the case, and also the method, the ontology and the epistemology behind that, particularly the ontology. The ontology is the nature of the truth. This is in classical books like Yin's book. So reading that gives you that ring of confidence of why you're doing that. The next level is to give rich descriptions, because that helps you to do the naturalistic generalization, to look at using theoretical or other frameworks, because that gives you more structure so that you can have generalization. And the next one is to use mixed methods approaches and feel confident in using mixed method approaches and describing them. So most people will have one or more of these already, but it's just beginning to feel confident in it and start writing like that. And my experience is that many researchers are not particularly explicit about the context. They're not explicit about using a framework to make sense of it for transferability. They're not using mixed methods. And that diminishes the quality for me as a reader of other people's research. And I think by having the discipline of using case study research and that as a methodology, is that it gives you that discipline that this is what you need to do. So for me, the great strength of case study research is to give that degree of rigor to the research that you are doing. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, she is
Good.
okay with the answer.
Okay.
Anybody else who have any questions, comments? Okay, I'll take that as a no. Thank you so much, John, for sharing your time, your expertise, your knowledge. We all enjoyed today. I can say that on behalf of all CVU family. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
And everyone, we have another webinar next Saturday, so I will be sharing a flyer and details as soon as they're ready. So please keep a lookout for it, and I will see you guys next Saturday. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you very much. Bye, everyone. Thank you very much, and I hope you found it useful.
Thank you. Thank you so
Okay.
much. Bye-bye.
Okay.